Welcome everyone. My name is Deirdre Anderson and I have the pleasure to serve as the Executive Director of the Hingham Historical Society. What a wonderful crowd on a cold afternoon. Thank you for coming. Well, we are thrilled that you are here for the fourth of a 7-part series called The Spirit of Enterprise. And we are thrilled. This program has brought us much energy and enthusiasm this year, so thank you for participating in it. At the Hingham Historical Society, we are gearing up for a really great year of programming in 2019. And we thank you for the many of you in this room that have already generously donated to our annual appeal, which of course you know fills the coffers for us to keep this beautiful building and Old Ordinary operating. We're also about to embark on our 2019 annual membership campaign. And of course, like most cultural institutions, we have both annual membership, which pays for the day-to-day operations, and an appeal, which feeds our endowment, which is critical for us to be able to offer programming and keep the lights on. But today we are thrilled to welcome Steve Hurley, and this program is being broadcast by our friends at Harbor Media, who are great partners in making sure that everyone in the community has access to the programs we have here. Chris and Sharon from Harbor Media are here. Thank you both so much. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our education chair and board member, Elizabeth Danis, who will tell you more about our esteemed speaker and the series.
Thank you, Deirdre. Today, we welcome Steve Hurley for a lecture series entitled The Fish and Fisheries of Hingham and Hingham Bay, Mackerel, Rainbow Smelt, and more. Before I introduce Steve, I want to remind you of our next event in the Spirit of Enterprise series, A Taste of Two Cultures, Colonial and Native American Lunch. It's planned for February the 2nd, 12 o'clock noon at Plymouth Plantation. Reservations are required for this event and must be made by Friday, January the 25th. After our presentation today, we invite you to the second floor to enjoy a cup of fish chowder donated by Christian Thompson of Liberty Grill. Yes, yes. As you leave today, please notice the membership table on the second floor. We invite you to join the Hingham Historical Society or to renew your membership if you have not done so. Now today's guest speaker. Steve grew up fishing for cod, mackerel, and flounder in Hingham Bay and Boston Harbor. He decided to become a fisheries biologist while fishing for wild trout in the Weir River in New Hampshire. He also fished for fishing for wild brook trout in New Hampshire. He also fished for rainbow and brook trout in the Weir River while attending Hingham High School, and now manages the Weir River stocking and the freshwater fisheries of southeastern Massachusetts for the Massachusetts Division of Fisheries and Wildlife. Steve earned a Bachelor of Science in Fisheries Biology at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst and a master's degree in Fisheries Biology from Iowa State University, where he studied the movements of shovel-nosed sturgeon with radio tags in the upper Mississippi River. Steve went on to work as a fisheries research biologist for the Ohio Division of Wildlife for 6 years before returning to his home state in 1990 to become the Southeast District Fisheries Manager. One of his specialties is sea-run brook trout restoration. He has been a member of the American Fisheries Society since 1977 and serves as its Secretary-Treasurer of the Fisheries History Section. Please join me in welcoming Steve Hurley.
was wild trout weren't in the Weir River, and I'm going to be talking about that a little later here. So I want to give you a little flavor for the history of fish and fishing here in Hingham, the Hingham I grew up with and the Hingham of the past. So for a typical Hingham resident, their exposure to the fisheries is the fish and seafood counter at Stop and Shop, or eating fish chowder at the Liberty Grill and the other fine restaurants here in Hingham. But that's not the entire history of fisheries in Hingham. We have a rich fisheries history, which I'll be telling you about, including Native American use, a lot of commercial fisheries that still exist to this day, and some significant people that were significant in the fisheries of Massachusetts. So Hingham's original name was Bear Cove, and that kind of gives you an indication of the habitat here in Hingham Harbor. Basically large flats of shellfish habitat, essentially. Gets low tide. At low tide, there's a large expanse of mud flats out there, which are great habitat for soft-shell clams and other shellfish. In fact, there were oysters here in Hingham Harbor at one time, judging by the evidence in shellfish middens, which are basically the remains of Native American encampments here in Hingham. Hingham had a history dating back at least 8,000 years of Native American use of this area, back when sea levels were much lower. Originally, Hingham had 3 tidal rivers going down there, surrounded by these hills called drumlins. And as the sea levels rose, even more shellfish habitat was created, and the Native Americans made extensive use of this on a seasonal basis. And their remains are found in shellfish middens, or what archaeologists use to research what the Indians were eating and that sort of thing. And the shellfish middens were common in this area at one time, but later on with all the farmers, a lot of those shellfish middens were dug up and they used them as fertilizer or lime for the fields. Next slide. So when Elizabeth first contacted me about giving a talk or finding somebody to give a talk about fisheries in Hingham, she mentioned cod. And well, I was like, well, cod were found as a fisheries in Hingham, but they're not what Hingham is famous for. But the reason Hingham was founded was actually due to the codfish. Basically, European fishermen discovered the cod fishing grounds in the 1400s off the northeast coast. And that's what attracted the English, the Portuguese, the Basque fishermen to this area. They were fishing for cod. And later on, cod became an important staple in Massachusetts fisheries. Our symbol in the State House is the sacred cod. Some of the biggest fishing ports in the Northeast were found here in Massachusetts. The Port of Gloucester, which is still a major port, and the Port of New Bedford, which actually has the highest amount of value for a fisheries port in the United States, it even beats Alaska, and that's due to sea scallops now instead of cod. The cod is actually a very sad story because that abundance of cod that attracted people to this area is no longer here. They actually shut down the Grand Banks fishery off Newfoundland because of the poor status of the cod. And as a recreational fisherman today, you're not allowed to keep cod off the Massachusetts coast anymore. So what was Hingham like when the settlers first came here in the 1600s? Well, Hingham was a heavily wooded area with a lot of dense old growth trees. And the streams that flowed down through Hingham supported cold, clean waters that were home to sea-run brook trout and another anadromous fish. As Elizabeth mentioned, the sea-run brook trout are kind of my specialty in southeastern Massachusetts because there's very few of them left. So I spend a lot of my time actually preserving the sea-run brook trout and researching them. And so it's kind of my specialty in my job as a Southeast District Fisheries Manager. But sea-run trout are no longer found in Hingham, but there are other species that are still found here. Our native riverine species were the brook trout, also along with the redfin pickerel, a small fish called the tessellated darter, and white sucker. Those were our native riverine fishes. Here in Massachusetts, we have a very limited fish fauna. We don't have a lot of variety of fish species, but we did have these species found in our streams originally. The brook trout is still found in Hingham. There's 2 little segments of streams in Hingham that still support the wild brook trout. But for the most part, the rivers here in Hingham have been heavily modified. They support only warm water species like redfin pickerel and basically fish that come out of the impounded ponds. So the brook trout are still here, but they're remnants of what they used to be here in Hingham. Nowadays, the trout fishery that I grew up with is supported by the stocking. That's my day job, is to manage the trout fisheries of southeastern Massachusetts. And Because of all the modifications that have happened in eastern Massachusetts, we have to rely on stocking trout to support the demand for trout fisheries. So in the spring, most of my job is stocking the ponds in the Plymouth and Cape Cod area with trout, as well as streams throughout southeastern Massachusetts. We still stock the Weir River in Hingham at 5 locations with brook trout, which are a native species, as well as rainbow trout, which originated in the Pacific coast, and brown trout from Europe. We still also stock a little segment up on the Plymouth River near Ward Street, and also Whitman's Pond in Weymouth is stocked, but that's the Northeast District. So what was found in our ponds originally? Well, originally our native pond species were chain pickerel, yellow perch, pumpkin seed, and golden shiner. It's a very limited fish base out there in our ponds. And in fact, our only sizable pond in Hingham was Acrid Pond in Hingham. So in my job as Southeast District Fisheries Manager, I live here in Hingham, but Hingham has a very small freshwater resource compared to other places in southeastern Massachusetts. So I don't spend a lot of time as my job as Southeast Fisheries Manager actually managing the fisheries here in my hometown. Hingham does support some recreational pond fisheries. The fishermen that buy the licenses, that pay my salary, can still fish for species like largemouth bass in Cushing Pond, but the largemouth is not a native species that was introduced in the 1850s to Massachusetts. Smallmouth bass were once stocked up at Fulling Mill Pond and Acrid Pond by our agency years ago, but both those ponds are now closed as water supplies. And Triphammer Pond in the Yarron River Reservoir do support a limited recreational warm water fishery. But the big story of Hingham's fish is the anadromous fish, the fish that move from the salt water and move up into the fresh waters to spawn. And the Native Americans took advantage of this abundance of resources by building fish weirs. The slide there shows an annual event on Boston Common where the Native Americans, survivors and descendants actually set up this fish weir model on the Boston Common. And basically they were built of stakes and sticks, and they made a little web. And this slide right here is the Boylston Street Fish Weir. Actually, in the city of Boston, they discovered fish weirs dating back thousands of years. So as they're building these skyscrapers in Boston, they found remnants of Native American fish weirs in downtown Boston. And people here in Hingham, Weir River as our major river, well, its name comes from a fish weir. In 1637, the town authorized Thomas Loring, Clement Bates, Nicholas Jacob, and Joseph Andrews to erect a fish weir in the Weir River in 1637. That was the settlers erecting that fish weir, but I'm sure there were Native American fish weirs in the Weir River before then, but we haven't found any evidence that I know of to indicate that. But I'm sure if you really dug deep into the sediments of the Weir River, you can find some Native American fish weirs. So anadromous species are basically fish that live in the salt water. They migrate up into the freshwaters to spawn. They include species like the alewife and blueback herring, which are very similar species, and they're basically lumped together as river herring because they're very difficult to tell apart. There's a thing about the eye size, but I have difficulty myself telling them apart for the most part, so we just call them river herring. There were also fish like the white perch, which migrated up and spawned in the spring in these rivers, and the rainbow smelt, which came up into the rivers in the spring and spawned. And we'll be talking a lot more about the rainbow smelt because it was a significant fish in the history of Hingham. So a lot of these fisheries were very important to the early colonial people. And one of the most important laws that was passed was the Colonial Ordinances of 1641 to 1647, which basically allowed people to own to the low water mark. But the fisheries and the shellfish were reserved for the people of the Commonwealth. So people have the right to go down and fish in the tidal waters and to pass between the high and the low water mark to gain access to fishing. And it also allows them access to the great ponds, which are natural ponds over 10 acres in size. So people are allowed to pass over unapproved land on foot for the purposes of fishing on our great ponds in Massachusetts and also our tidal areas. But changes happened very soon here in Hingham that changed our lands and waters. There was a tidal mill that was erected in 1643 down at what's called the Mill Pond. Now we know it as Station Street. And Liberty Grill, where the fish charter came from, was actually built on the site of this original mill. So these tidal mills supplied power for the early settlers as sawmills and a variety of other things. But they did modify the habitats and modified the fisheries. So fishing occurred, Hingham mostly was mainly farmers and that sort of thing. In the 1600s, people focused in on farming for the most part, but there was a little fishing industry throughout the early days of Hingham. But Hingham really became important as a fishing port with the arrival of Captain Francis Barker in 1750. And he set up a little shipyard and fishing area at the bottom of what is now known as Ship Street. The original name for this was actually Fish Street, but it's now known as Ship Street. And if you drive down to the end of Ship Street as it enters kind of where Station Street is now, you'll see a sign where Peter Hobart landed. And so you look at that sign now, and it's like all pavement all around it. But that was actually the mill pond, and so they could actually sail up right to that one location and disembark back in the 1630s. So a fishing company was formed in 1752 by a variety of names that you might recognize. Thaxter, there's a Hersey, a Levitt, Barker, and Cushing, all familiar names here in Hingham. And Dr. Ezekiel Hersey is a very famous person in Hingham. He started the Harvard Medical School, and his money was actually left to his wife, Sarah Derby, who founded Derby Academy, which we are right now. So actually some of the money that founded this Derby Academy might have actually come from the fishing fleets of Dr. Hersey. So some of the records that we have are the indication of fish flakes were set up in Hingham Harbor. That was in the early the late 1700s. And fish flakes are actually racks for drying fish. Before the advent of refrigeration and ice and that sort of thing, you had to preserve fish by drying them and salting them. And so basically in the Hingham Harbor in the late 1700s, there was all kinds of these racks set up. And here's a picture of fish flakes in Provincetown that were set up in the late 1800s. And so basically you would split the codfish, you would salt them, and then you would lay them out in the sun to dry. And they preserved a food commodity called salt cod. So they would have to spend a lot of time out there. If it rained, they'd have to cover them all up. But basically that was how they preserved fish back in the day, was drying and salting. So they used both cod and a species called hake was the primary things that they were using these fish flakes for. In whaling, this picture here is kind of a spoof photo that was generated by, I guess, the guy down at Red Eye Roasters that showed the big flood that we had here this last year. But there was some whaling in Hingham. Right after the Revolutionary War, Alexander Starbuck in the History of Whaling mentions Hingham as sending out at least one ship to the whaling grounds right after the Revolutionary War. But the whaling was basically taken over by the ports of New Bedford and Nantucket in Massachusetts. But there are still whales in Hingham. This is a picture of a killer whale from Alaska, but back in 1982, a killer whale actually appeared in Hingham Harbor. This same whale actually showed up in Provincetown that same year. So it's not out of the ordinary that we do have whales occasionally still in Hingham. Another marine mammal that was once hunted in Hingham Bay is the harbor seal. You can still find these in the winter down in Hingham. And there was actually a bounty here in Hingham and other parts of Massachusetts until the early 1960s, where basically a fisherman would get money for the nose of a seal. He would bring it to the town clerk, and the town clerk would pay the fisherman between $2 and $5, depending on the year, as a bounty on the seal. Nowadays, you still find seals in Hingham Harbor. In fact, back when I was in high school, I found a dead seal on Slate Island, and I brought it in and reported it to the New England Aquarium and talked to the biologist there, who basically gave me some advice on how to become a fisheries biologist. He had actually attended UMass. And you still find seals. I found a couple dead seals over the years here in Hingham, and you still see them in the winter on the rocks. Some of the early laws that were out there actually dealt with Hingham. In 1805, there was an act to regulate the taking of fish called shad and alewife in the town of Hingham. And basically, it was one of the earliest fisheries laws that we have on the books here in Hingham about opening up fish passage for alewife. And so basically, it empowered a town committee to actually open up passage into Ackerd Pond, which was the spawning grounds at the time for the alewife. The shad are basically no longer found here. The marine fisheries had tried to stock shad a number of times into the number of times into the area, but they haven't had much success. So this town committee actually operated at least up until the 1940s here in Hingham. The biggest run in the state, though, is actually in Weymouth Back River, but some of the Hingham residents are actually responsible for help managing the runs over in the Weymouth Back River. A Hingham resident named John Smith was a herring warden for the Weymouth Back River for many years, and the present herring warden for the town of Weymouth is actually the photographer here in town, George Loring III. So the Weymouth Back River, its runs have gone up and down over the years, but it's still one of the major herring runs left in Massachusetts. Herring runs have declined throughout Massachusetts, but the Weymouth Back River one is still operating fairly good. Next slide. But the fish that really made Hingham famous is the mackerel. And this is a picture that I really liked that was taken by our photographer for Mass Wildlife, Bill Byrne, who passed away this year. And it shows a mink eating a mackerel on the Cape Cod Canal. And it's a really nice picture of the mackerel. And it shows that many different animals subsist on mackerel besides humans. Mammals like the mink, and they're food for a variety of fish like tuna, striped bass, and a huge variety of other sea creatures and birds. So the mackerel is a schooling fish. It's a member of the tuna family. It's found in great abundance. It comes up off the Massachusetts coast in the spring to spawn, and it was found in huge numbers off the coast of Massachusetts. It became a very famous fish in the fisheries of Massachusetts. There was actually a book that you can actually get on the internet that was published here in Hingham back in the 1820s, and it's a record of the mackerel fisheries here in Hingham. And they list the vessels back in 1815 with vessel names like the Comet, Friendship, Six Brothers, Welcome Return, and the captains, who included a lot of the starters, a captain named James Marble, and other people that were the captains of these ships. And these ships would sail from Hingham with a crew of about 8 to 10 people, and they were about 60-ton schooners. And this shows a mackerel schooner that was fished from Gloucester, actually, but it's very similar to what the schooners were from Hingham. And so basically they were sail-operated ships, and hundreds of these vessels would go out into Cape Cod Bay and up off the coast of Maine and even into Canada after the mackerel. And next slide. And so how they would catch these mackerel, they would actually, what was called tolling for mackerel. The fishermen today would call it chumming for mackerel. And they would take bait like menhaden or clams, and in the old days they would chop it up with axes and throw it over the side. And later on they developed bait mills to grind this fish up. And that would attract the schools of mackerel to the sailing ship. So they had these little buckets on the side, and they would sit there and they would chum out and try to attract the mackerel schools to come up to the side of the fish. And these illustrations were actually from a book called from Goody in 1882, The History of the Fisheries and Fisheries Industries in the United States. And it's a great old record of the early fishing industries here in Massachusetts and throughout the country. So Hingham was famous for the mackerel hook fishery. They were actually jigging for mackerel. They didn't use nets. They were actually hand jigging them up over the side. And so they would sit there with multiple lines, either 6 to 8 lines with one fisherman, and they would sit on the side of the boat and they would actually jig these mackerel up over the sides. So it was a very sustainable fishery, unlike the trawl fisheries we have today where giant nets sweep the ocean floor. They basically went out and they were hooking them over the sides. They didn't have the fixed gear, which has become a problem for whales and other creatures, or anything like that. So it was a very sustainable fishery at the time. And so this slide kind of shows how it worked, the whole system, where they would bait it over, they would jig for mackerel, they would put it up over the side and put them in the barrels, and later on they would salt them down to preserve them. Next slide. And so the mackerel jigs they were using were actually pieces of lead that were on the hook. And some indications are that it was actually a person from Hingham here that actually invented the mackerel jig. Some people claim it was people up in Pigeon Cove and Gloucester, but at least 2 Maine fishermen thought it was somebody here from Hingham that invented it between 1810 and 1814. Nowadays, there's different jigs used called Christmas tree jigs, or this little diamond jig, which is what I grew up fishing for mackerel here in Hingham. I'd go out in a little rowboat and I would troll my little diamond jig and catch mackerel back when I was in high school. Next slide. So this mackerel fishery lasted for many years, but its peak years were between 1815 and 1830. And you can see some of the names there, like Demerick Stoddard, Luther Stoddard, Malachi Barnes, Solomon Dill. So sometimes these fishermen would be the best for many years in a row. Like the fish called the Favorite or the Only Daughter were the top vessels in the Hingham fishing fleet. And if you're interested in more, you can actually go online and find this book that lists all kinds of information on how many barrels of mackerel they caught and the captains of these vessels and that sort of thing. So Hingham's mackerel catch peaked about 1831. You can see a steep rise from when it started right after the War of 1812. And basically, many, many vessels were involved in catching mackerel out of Hingham. And this mackerel was salted. They would basically put the mackerel in barrels and salt it. And the main export was actually down into the West Indies in the southern states. These mackerel from Hingham were used to feed slaves. Now, Hingham prides itself as being kind of an abolitionist town, but a lot of the wealth in early Hingham was actually generated by selling fish that fed slaves down in the West Indies and in the southern states. And you can see the catch dropped off right around the 1830s. That's when they basically banned the importation of slaves to the French and British West Indies. And then as the fishery declined, in both because of the slave trade being cut off, as well as the ups and downs of the mackerel fishery. But as late as about 1880, there was still a mackerel schooner here in Hingham. But by then, it was only about 2 vessels that were actually shipping out of Hingham. So next time you're out walking your dog at Stoddar's Neck with everybody else, you might have a little better understanding of where that name comes. The Stoddard was a very important name here in Hingham in the mackerel fishery. A lot of these names were actually interrelated. If you look back in the genealogy and the history of Lincoln, you can see all the different interconnections between people out there in Hingham. And a lot of it related back to the mackerel fishery in the early 1800s. So this was a tough life going out there on the mackerel schooners. These were small boats out in the weather. And just some of the information that I could detect, there was definitely some losses of life of the Hingham mackerel schooners. And these were tragedies when a ship went down because a lot of people were related. You could see there was a lot of Stoddards that died. There was also some Nichols that were basically 3 brothers from Scituate that died in the wreck of the Cyrus. So these are just some of the people that actually died in the mackerel fishery. There's other people that fell off the docks and drowned in Hingham Harbor, and a wide variety of people that died during this fishery. Fishing to this day remains the most dangerous industry out there in the United States, the most deaths. But it wasn't just the fishing industry that Hingham benefited from. Fishing takes a lot of different things to go along with it. The barrel makers. Hingham is famous as Bucket Town. But these mackerel schooners actually employed coopers down at the docks to actually build the barrels. And the barrels that were built were actually wrapped with these thin saplings. If you live up in Hingham near Gardner Street, there's a hill up there called Hoop Pole Hill. And it got its name from the saplings that were cut down to supply the barrels for the mackerel fishery. And you can see in this picture of a barrel that actually thin sapling that was wrapped around the barrel. But the most important commodity was salt. As I mentioned, salt was what was used to preserve fish back in the 1800s. And salt was a very important commodity. I mean, you hear in salt water, you figure, oh, you just boil the salt. But it takes many, many cords of wood to make salt by boiling. So it's very energy intensive. And so they developed a process after the War of 1812 where they actually evaporated seawater. And here in Hingham, we had 3 salt works. There was one on what is now Derby Academy down near Broad Cove. There was some at the bathing beach and then some over at World's End. So there were at least 3 salt works here in Hingham. And actually one of the first publications of the Historical Society was the Old Salt Works by Sears. It was written in 1916. And I bet if you looked into it, he might be related to the Sears that started the salt works down in Dennis on Cape Cod. But there were many other industries that were incorporated here with Hingham's fishing industry. There was the shipbuilding that occurred at Broad Cove at the bottom of Ship Street, as well as in the North River. But there are many other industries that were associated with these fishing industries. You had to have sail makers to make the sails for these schooners. You had to have rope. Up near where is now the town hall, there were rope works that were in Hingham. And a lot of that rope was used to supply the fishing industry. To give you some idea of how many people were actually using this or employed here, in 1836, Hingham's mackerel fleet employed 50 boats, employing 450 men and boys, according to the History of Derby Academy. Now, to put that into perspective, the population of Hingham back in those days was only about 3,500. So this was a significant portion of the town was employed in the fishing industry back in the early 1800s. But by the late 1800s, the fisheries had declined here in Hingham and throughout Massachusetts. And in response to that, the Massachusetts Commission on Fisheries was formed, which is basically my predecessor agency, dating back to 1866. And the U.S. Commission on Fish and Fisheries was formed in 1871. So we're about 150 years later after the formation of these fisheries commissions to try to restore our fisheries. And by the late 1800s, here in Hingham, it was the tourist industry that was the main thing. People used to come down on steamboat down to Melville Gardens, but they were still enjoying clam bakes down in the harbor, just like the Native Americans that came down and were taking advantage of the shellfish resources in Hingham. People were coming down from Boston to enjoy the shellfish resources. But now most of those clams were probably dug up on Ipswich in the North Shore. A famous Hingham resident, David Lawrence Belding, is very famous in terms of the fisheries. He was the first biologist for the Massachusetts Commission on Fisheries. So up until that time, there was basically people that weren't professional biologists. So he was the first one that actually came with a scientific basis to research the fisheries in Massachusetts. And he grew up here, well, he lived here in Hingham, basically at the bottom of Pear Tree Hill. And he's actually buried a stone's throw from where we are. In fact, I might even be able to see his grave if I look carefully enough out there. But he's a very important figure in the history of fisheries of Massachusetts. He published a wide variety of publications in the early 1900s, one on the mollusk fisheries of Massachusetts, trying to improve the clams, oysters, and scallop fisheries of Massachusetts because they had declined so much. He also surveyed most of the great ponds. I mentioned they were natural ponds over 10 acres in size. Well, if you look in the files, the surveys from 1912 on just about every major pond in Massachusetts, and they were done by Dr. Belding and people that worked for him. He also looked at the alewife fisheries. I mentioned in 1805 there was a law to establish fish passage up into Accord Pond. Well, in the 1920s, Dr. Belding looked at the fish passage throughout Massachusetts and made suggestions on how to improve them for the alewife fisheries. So this is actually an example from the files of a survey that was done in 1912 by Dr. Belding and others. And he mentions Hingham Accord Pond being a source of Hingham's water supply, and a standpipe is being built and no bathing is allowed. So that was right after Accord Pond was taken over as Hingham's water supply. But there is this document out there that was done in 1912 where he did the survey on the pond. In the 1930s, fish were actually salvaged out of Accord Pond by our agency to stock other waters that were open to fishing in the Commonwealth. Steamers, soft-shelled clams, well, that is one of the most important fisheries in Hingham at one time. When Belding in 1909 wrote about Hingham's fisheries, it was carried on basically in a desultory manner, he said, by a few people that didn't really care much for digging except occasionally, but they would supply some of the hotels down in Nantasket at the time. And in 1909, Belding reported there were 250 bushels worth about $250 at the time, but they could possibly be improved or be improved so much that they could generate almost 20,000 bushels of clams, is what he estimated could be harvested from Hingham's shellfish flats. So shellfish harvest depends on good water quality. We've had a lot of changes to the water in Boston Harbor, mostly for the beneficial in the latest years. Boston has a big impact on the water quality here in Hingham. But the sewage from Boston was started to be developed in the 1870s and 1880s. They would pump the sewage out into Moon Island and then release it into the harbor. And in the 1970s, I have distinct memories of the sewers being constructed in Crow Point to try to improve the water quality of Hingham Harbor and Boston Harbor. In the 90s, basically sludge dumping ended, where they would basically take the sludge out and dump it back in, which caused all kinds of water quality problems. And that ended in 91, and I actually noticed a significant change in the water quality in Hingham for the better after that. And by 2000, they were no longer dumping sewage into Boston Harbor. It was being dumped in the outfall pipe. So the water quality has definitely improved in Hingham Harbor. So you would think that the shellfish fishery would improve along as well. But actually, Hingham's shellfish harvests are at an all-time low right now due to clam cancer and other factors. But by 1999, there were almost 14,000 bushels that were harvested here in Hingham. But at that time, they were all done. It was contaminated waters. They would have to be dug by master diggers, and they would have to be brought up to the purification plant up in Newburyport for decontaminating to get the bacteria out. But the harvest in 1999 was 14,000, which was pretty close to Belding's estimate of 20,000 as the maximum potential. And I have distinct memories of seeing the shellfish fishermen down at the harbor and digging in Hingham waters. You don't see that anymore. And in fact, in 2016, there were only 368 bushels that were harvested for Hingham. In the last 2 years, there's been no clams at all harvested. There's very few clams out there. There's actually several causes for that. The clam cancer, which is a disease that's passed between clams that just showed up maybe in the last 10 or 20 years, as well as introduced predators like the green crab. So hopefully the clams will recover at some time as the weaker clams die out and the ones that are survivors to this clam cancer will survive. But it's kind of a shame that such an important resource is no longer found in town. So Dr. Belding's works are still cited to this day. He's a very important part. They actually have an award in his name by the Division of Marine Fisheries. And if you're a shellfisherman on Cape Cod, you still read Dr. Belding's works. So this Hingham residents' works live on to this day, and it's still an important part of the fisheries of Massachusetts. Another Hingham resident was actually Mary Griffin, who was actually the first female commissioner of the Division of Fish and Game, and she was actually presenting the Belding Award, so presenting the Hingham resident, presenting another former Hingham resident's award to a guy named Dick Quinn, who actually worked for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service on fish ladders. So we've had several significant people in Hingham that are famous in the fisheries, Dr. Belding and Mary Griffin. But there's been a lot of changes to Hingham over time, both in the waters and in the land itself. You know, a lot of times when you look out at downtown Hingham, you don't realize that there's actually a brook running underneath the town. And when you're parking down on Station Street, a lot of people don't realize that was actually salt water at one time. So we've had a lot of changes, and if you read the book that I think is available downstairs when I think of Hingham, Michael Schillen talks about, we often fished in the old mill pond. You caught smelt, eel, mackerel, herring, flounder, and sometimes cod in that old mill pond. It'd be tough to catch a fish now under the Station Street parking lot. And the cod he refers to was probably not Atlantic cod, but what's called Atlantic tom cod, which are a small species of cod that migrate up in the winter to spawn in those areas like the old mill pond. They were found in great numbers in the Fore River and the Weir River at one time, but they've actually gone down in abundance like many others of our anadromous fish. But the fish that really made Hingham famous was the smelt. There's a book called The Hills of Hingham that's little descriptions of Hingham back in 1816. And in that book, she talks about everybody has heard of Hingham smelts. I mean, smelt were commercially harvested here in Hingham. They were sold in the Boston markets, and people really liked the Hingham smelt. It was a very common thing to read about in the paper, about Hingham smelt, how big they were. But they're not big fish. They talk about a large smelt. You can see the picture of a smelt. They're only about 8 or 10 inches long, but you could catch dozens at a time. The rainbow smelt is a fish that's really declined quite a bit in the Northeast. It's very sensitive to habitat disruptions. It comes out of the tide waters and spawns right at the first riffle in Massachusetts. And here in Hingham, we had multiple spawning areas, the Weir River, Town Brook, which ran through town, Broad Cove, Fresh Brook, and the Weymouth Back River. I remember distinctly seeing smelt in back of the old Walsh and Packard in downtown Hingham back in the 1970s. So there was still smelt at that time that would run up Town Brook. Now Town Brook is pretty much almost entirely under the railroad bed, and it's very little area of it actually comes out and is exposed to the sunlight. At Broad Cove was funny because Brad Chase, who was our anadromous fish biologist, wrote about the smelt fishery in Broad Cove, and he didn't know where they spawned. Well, I told him later I knew where they actually spawned. They didn't spawn in Broad Cove bound by Derby Academy, but they actually spawned all the way up on Nokomis Road in the Crow Point area, a little stream that came out of what was the Hingham shipyard. and it flows down by Foster School, and that smelt would actually run up to Broad Cove to spawn in that little stream. I went back there a few years ago, and the woman that lived next to her had never seen a smelt in that stream. So it's kind of a shame that these little spawning areas have disappeared over time. Smelt fishing was big in Hingham. It was very famous. This is a picture of an old postcard in black and white that shows the area down near the old Keogh's down in downtown Hingham, now by Red Eye Roasters. And the other picture was from the Richardson collection that's on the Hingham Historical Society website that shows people fishing back in the 1970s. So that's what I remember about living in Hingham back in the 1970s, is people always had a cane pole tucked away in their garage for smelt fishing. And all it took was a little cane pole and a piece of sea worm or a piece of shrimp to actually catch smelt in Hingham Harbor. Hingham actually had a fish hatchery back in 1918. It was the Weir River. Our agency actually set up an area where they would collect the smelt and use them to stock other waters in Massachusetts, collected right there at the Weir River in Hingham. And this continued for many years. Hingham's Weir River was a source of smelt for stocking throughout the waters of the Commonwealth and for other coastal rivers. So the Weir River was where people came to collect smelt eggs. And they would set out these trays down below the Foundry Pond Dam and then move the eggs to other rivers to try to reestablish the population. But unfortunately, some of the changes that have happened, when the town of Hingham repaired the dam in 1998, they damaged some of that smelt spawning habitat. They put a bunch of riprap down to protect the dam, and that destroyed some of that smelt spawning habitat. These dams were built over the smelt spawning riffles. It was usually the first riffle above the head of tide where smelt spawned, and that was where the colonial settlers would build their dams. So that's one of the reasons why smelt is such an endangered fish these days, is because of all these historic dams that were out there. So we found a lot of changes in the Weir River itself. The Weir River was never much of an alewife run. Based on some of the catch data in the 1880s, they were only catching a couple thousand smelt out of the Weir River, and that's because of basically the taking of the headwater ponds for water supply, Acrid Pond and Fulling Mill Pond and that sort of thing. So the Weir River was never a really big alewife run, at least in present day, and historically it was probably a very good run. So Triphammer Pond is where the alewife spawn these days. It's a small pond up near the Wampatuck State Park. And the Marine Fisheries actually cleared out the fish ladder in 1918 to hope to restore some of the alewife run up the Weir River. But the last counts I heard was basically, a handful of alewives would actually come up into the Weir River anymore compared to the run over in the Weymouth Back River. In this example here, this writing from Triphammer Pond was actually probably written by David Belding. I actually looked at the D's in the handwriting, and this little sketch of Triphammer Pond was actually done by David Belding probably. So it was kind of interesting hearing, the history of the Hingham resident and seeing, this stuff now that's still used to this day. Another fish that was common in Hingham was the eel. In the DAR history of Hingham, its early settlement, there's a note in there that talked about home meadows, people skating on the home meadows, and fishermen actually spearing eels through holes in the ice. And that was a common thing back in the early days of Hingham, Massachusetts, where people would go out with these multi-tine spears. They would dig a hole in the saltwater ice or freshwater ice, and they would poke around in the mud until they came upon a bunch of eels. And that actually, when I was a kid growing up, I heard people still doing that back in the 1970s. But the eels these days are basically believed to be a species in decline. They're still the most common species in southeastern Massachusetts. I find them quite often during my stream surveys, and they can get to be a pretty large size. The picture up in the corner is me holding an eel that's basically as big around as your arm from the Red Brook down on Bourne in Wareham. But the eels come up, they have a pretty interesting life history. They're basically raised or spawned off of Bermuda, and they come up with the Gulf Stream, and they migrate up by the thousands into our coastal streams. And it's actually, there's a poaching that goes on. They actually sell these glass eels now over for aquaculture over in the Asian market. So there's actually poaching that goes on. So if you see people with nets down in one of the coastal rivers in the spring with name plates, call the environmental police, because they're probably poachers. One of the big studies that was done on Hingham and Hingham Bay was done in 1973 was a Massachusetts Division of Marine Fisheries study. They surveyed all of the estuaries in Massachusetts and looked at the fish population of Hingham and what the economic values of that fishery was. When they went out there, they collected thousands of fish. The biggest fish was the Atlantic silverside, which is a small bait fish. They caught those primarily in the seines. But almost 1/3 of the fish that they caught were winter flounder back in the 1970s. And at that time, they estimated $600,000 were expended on sport fishing in Hingham Bay in 1970. And at that time, the Weir River supports one of the largest smelt runs in the Commonwealth. So a lot has changed since then. Flounder were a big thing in Hingham Bay back when I was a kid growing up. There were boat liveries over in Howell's Neck and in Howell where people would come up by the busloads from New Jersey to rent these small boats, and they would go out fishing in Hingham Bay. And there was an active bait fishery. People would have to buy the bait. Bait was bought at places like Keogh's in downtown Hingham. We would sell shrimp also for the smelt fishery, but primarily the sea worms for the flounder fishery. And there was actually a little barge called the bait barge that was moored in the Weir River that was owned by the Fage family of Wampatuck Road, that we'd go out there by boat and we'd pull up to the bait barge and get our supply of sea worms and go out and catch fish off of Bumpkin Island. There were also head boats like the Quincy Party Boat Company in Hingham Shipyard where people would basically pay to go on the boat and go out flounder fishing. My brother would actually operate as a deckmate on there and help fillet the catch after people would catch them. So you can still catch flounder out there. There's a picture of my son with the flounder. So they're still out there, and they're coming back a little bit, but it's nothing like it was when I was a kid growing up. Back in the 1980s, the flounder fishing had declined. You'd go out there, and basically all you would catch were skates. A lot of the flounders actually had tumors on them from contaminants. There was a professor called Dr. Michael Moore of Woods Hole that's done a lot of the work on it. I've actually worked with him on some of the issues on Cape Cod over the years. But the flounder fishing was very poor, both from the tumor standpoint and also the numbers were very, very low. They are coming back a little bit, but it's still nothing like it used to be. One shining spot actually in Hingham fisheries is the lobster fishery. There is still an active commercial fishery in Hingham, and it's for the lobsters. A lot of people don't know, but if you go down in the very corner of the shipyard near Stotter's Neck, there's a little dock down there that supports about 17 boats for the lobster fishery in Hingham. So it's still out there. They caught in 2006, which was one of the recent ones that I could find. They caught over 200,000 pounds of lobsters in 8,000 traps. So the lobster fishery is still very important. It was important back in the 1980s. There's a picture of my brother and I back in 1981. My brother had a student commercial license here in Hingham, and that was a fun job actually going out and trying to catch lobster. That was a fun summer. So the lobster fishery is still very active here in Hingham, so we still do have a commercial fishery. But one of the things that sets the lobster fishery apart from a lot of the other commercial fisheries is it's almost like aquaculture. They use a lot of bait in the form of herring. They bait up the traps. They put the lobsters come into the traps, and if they're short, they throw them back out. So it's almost like a aquaculture in theory, because they're baiting up the traps, they're feeding the small ones, and they don't harvest them until they're of legal size. So it's a little different than a lot of the other commercial fisheries. There is still a little industry for the rockweed. I took a picture of this just actually a couple of weeks ago of these guys that actually make a living harvesting rockweed from Hingham Harbor and other places to actually pack the lobsters for shipment throughout the country. So there is a little market still for seaweed here in Hingham, believe it or not. Scituate was very famous for the Irish moss, which was used as a thickener for ice cream and other things. But here in Hingham, it's the rockweed that's still harvested. But the big fishery here in Hingham these days, if you talk to most people, it's the stripers. Stripers are very important as a recreational sport fishery. They're also a commercial fishery in Massachusetts. At one time, over 1 million pounds were harvested in the commercial fishery in Massachusetts. But for most people, it's the striped bass that attract people to fish in Hingham Harbor these days. You can still catch them, especially the schoolies. Down near what was Keogh's Ship Chandlery, there was actually a saltwater fly fishing shop for a while. And that was basically driven by the large populations of schoolie stripers. People would go out and fly fish for stripers in Hingham Harbor for these schoolie stripers. So the striped bass is still one of the shining points in our fisheries, and it supports a very important recreational fishery. Most of the people that own boats in Hingham probably go out and fish for striped bass at some point. Next slide. You can also catch bluefish out there occasionally. Back in the 1980s, there were large populations of bluefish that would come into Hingham Harbor after schools of pogies, which are a bait fish. And so the bluefish would be in after the pogies, and there were large schools of bluefish, pretty large bluefish that would come into Hingham Harbor. A few years ago, I was fishing down in Hingham Harbor with my wife's family and their sons, and they were catching these small fish. They didn't know what it was, or they were trying to catch them. So I went there, and they turned out to be snapper blues, which are very small baby bluefish. And that was something new to me. We never used to have snapper blues here in the harbor, but it's an indication that things are changing. They're found commonly on the south coast in Buzzards Bay, so it was a little unusual to find schools of snapper blues here up in Hingham Harbor. I mentioned them in Hayden. That's a bait fish. They're very important in the bait fishery for the lobster fishery. A lot of the lobster fishery here in Hingham is based on the commercial catch of menhaden for bait. We actually had something that made the news in 2016 where a large fish kill of menhaden happened in Hingham Harbor due to stranding and low oxygen. So the pogies were an important part of the fish here in Hingham at one point, coming in to attract a lot of those game fish like the striped bass. But there's been a lot of changes. There's a lot more changes probably coming to Hingham, and that's due to climate change. We mentioned the cod fishery declining. The Gulf of Maine is warming more than any other body of water on planet Earth, and that's caused a lot of changes in the fisheries. We're starting to see some southern species actually show up here in Boston Harbor. These include the black sea bass, which just showed up probably about 10 or 20 years ago to the fauna of Hingham Harbor. And there's actually been reports of scup, which are basically found primarily in Cape Cod South, but the scup even now occasionally coming up into Hingham Harbor. Another thing I mentioned, oysters early on is being found in Hingham Harbor. Well, the oysters disappeared very soon, but I took these pictures actually down on the beach I live near just a while ago, and they're actually European oysters that were found up from Salem. They did a oyster grant up there where they used European oysters, and these fish, or these oysters, are actually showing up here in Hingham. They're flat, they're not as interesting looking or as much meat as the American oyster, but they are showing up here in numbers in Hingham, so it's something different. So we've had a lot of changes in the fisheries of Hingham over the years. A lot of it's been declines, but there's also introduced species that have shown up, like the green crab and also the oyster. So at this point, I'd be glad to answer any of the questions or any comments that you want on the history of the fisheries here in Hingham. We have a rich history, and hopefully you've learned a little bit today about it. Jerry?
Were you aware that at one time the Hingham Highway Department used to clear cut the Weir River with a bulldozer?
Yes, actually, that was in the 1950s, where they actually channelized the Weir River. And that's a thing, I mean, I'm a fisheries biologist, so that's one of the things we're trying to keep people to improve the habitat. So as they channelized the river, that probably wiped out a lot of the habitat for the trout and the other species. So there's been a lot of changes here in Hingham in terms of our management of the water resources, particularly Town Brook, which, a lot of people don't even know there's a river running under downtown Hingham. And the Weir River has had a lot of changes to it over time. But I was aware of that, and the culvert management is a big thing in Hingham here, as in other places. You have to maintain the storm drains, you have to maintain the culverts, and all the infrastructure that goes along with it.
Going back to one of the first things you said when you started about fishing for cod in the 1400s, that reminded me of reading Mark Kurlansky's book about cod, and I thought it was sort of a theory, but is it fairly well established that well before Columbus, the Portuguese were fishing off?
Oh yeah, no, that's, if you're interested in the cod fisheries, that's an excellent book to read about it. But it was the fishermen that basically discovered this area, and that's kind of what attracted people to this area. In fact, when the Pilgrims came over here, they saw the map, Cape Cod, and they thought it might be a good place to come. So the cod fisheries are basically responsible for the discovery of Massachusetts, I believe. It was the fishermen that were here, and unfortunately, the fishermen that came here also brought a few other things with them, including the diseases that basically wiped out the Native American population. So when the Pilgrims came over here in 1620 and the people came to Hingham in 1635, they found an abundance of land with a lot of cleared fields, and that's because the Native Americans had basically been wiped out by diseases that were brought by the fishermen in the early 1600s.
But in the 1400s, we can forget Columbus. He wasn't the first.
Nope, there was other people here before it. And, but like fishermen today, a lot of people, they keep it secret to themselves where they're getting all the good fish.
Portuguese were good at that.
Yeah.
Could you describe a fish weir? I'm not clear exactly
Okay, it's
what it's made of.
a fish weir is a trap. These days it's made out of netting, but historically the Native Americans would build them primarily. They would take larger tree trunks and they would drive them vertically into the ground, and then they would interweave it kind of like a basket with smaller trees and branches and that sort of thing. And so basically as the fish came in with the tide, they would kind of go over the tops of these weirs, and then as the tide came out, they would get funneled into a pocket. And then the Native Americans and other people could just dip them out with a net. And it was a very common method of catching fish historically. It's still used today. In fact, down on Cape Cod, there might still be a few fish weirs. And it was a very effective method of fishing because the fish were always fresh as well.
You mentioned, the water quality seems to be improving quite a bit, but it doesn't seem like seems like a lot of the fish populations are not doing that well. Is that why that would be?
Right. Yeah, that's kind of one of the conundrums. All the money that's been spent on, cleaning up the waters, and our fisheries haven't responded. There's so many changes that have been made to the habitat of Hingham and other places. I mean, we're just looking at the huge populations we have, and so we're cleaning up the point sources of pollution, but the non-point sources of pollution might actually be some of the bigger factors out there. I mentioned that clam cancer that is infecting the shellfish. Well, one of the things that they found is the higher incidences of this clam cancer is found in areas with high contaminant loads like New Bedford Harbor. And so basically you have a disease comes through and it hits the fish and shellfish that are already stressed. And they could be stressed by non-point source pollution. And one of the big things that's been in the news lately is some calculations that people made that by the year 2050, there's going to be more plastic in the ocean than fish. And if that's not a disturbing fact, then it really should be. It just shows you the impact that humans have on our environment. And you look here in Massachusetts, we've had almost 400 years of development. And early on, a lot of that damage started with the dams and that sort of thing, and we're trying to correct that. We actually have Beth Lambert in the audience here, who is the head of the Division of Ecological Restoration, and one of her jobs is to remove a lot of these dams. And so we're making progress on habitat restoration here in Massachusetts, but we have a long way to go. We take one step forward, but 2 steps back. And the thing that people have to realize is all the actions we take impact our resources and our fisheries. Every time people flush the toilet here in Hingham, basically they have to remember that water came out of Ackerd Pond, and it's basically being contaminated with whatever they add to it, and then it's being flushed out into Massachusetts Bay. And if you look at how many people are out there, we still have a huge impact on our resources.
How can I find out about where the trout and so on that you're stocking?
You can go on to our website, masswildlife.org. We have a website, and all that information is put out there. There's actually an interactive map that basically shows you where we stock the fish the day after I put them out. But it's here in Hingham, it's primarily the Weir River and the Plymouth River. But for the most part, the bulk of the great fishing is down in the Plymouth and Cape Cod area where we have these deep kettle hole ponds.
What are the chances of the cod population ever rebounding to a sustainable level?
Well, hopefully, good question. There's a lot going on with the cod fishery besides overfishing. We're facing, I mentioned the Gulf of Maine warming faster than any other body of the water. The cod is a cold water fish. So it may be a long while, if ever, before it recovers to those levels that we saw historically. Hopefully they will come back. We have started to see an increase in the flounder. Had a good report on the smelt fishery in the Weir River. But hopefully it's going to come back a little, but we probably will never see the levels that we saw in the 1400s.
So I'm going to stop us. If we could probably go on and on, but that fish chowder is just sort of pulling me down. So
take advantage of that.
Steve, a round of applause. Steve, on behalf of the Education Committee and the Hingham Historical Society, we have a little something for
Okay,
you.
thank you.
As well as, and you have.
Oh, yeah. Oh, sorry. I have it downstairs. A complimentary membership, and that was so fascinating. I think of
It was absolutely
Dr.
wonderful.
Belding and Ms. Griffin and Steve Hurley. You continued a great tradition, and what an honor to have you here today. I learned so much. So thank you.
Well, enjoy the fish chowder
Fish
and
chowder.
ask what fish it is when you're eating it.
Right. Good point.